Well, coffee drinkers are swallowing higher prices, and it's about to get worse. Coffee prices spiked 14.5% in July from a year ago. That's according to BLS data. And while the average retail price for a pound of ground coffee hitting $8.41, and that's before President Trump's 50% tariffs on imports from Brazil hit. Brazil is the world's top coffee producer. The U.S. gets more than a third of its unroasted coffee imports from Brazil. And here with more is Richard Volpe, former USDA economist and Cal Poly professor of agribusiness. Ricky, it is good to see you. So let's start there with Trump imposing this tariff on Brazilian goods. Ricky, for the U.S. coffee industry, how important is Brazil? Can you just help us quantify that?
Oh, it's the largest exporter of coffee beans to the U.S. for sure. And you know, the fact that these tariffs are going into place right now and are affecting a place like Brazil, it's just right now we're having a very important reminder that these tariffs, which are almost surely going to have noticeable impacts on food prices in the coming weeks and months, they don't happen in a vacuum. Everyone's aware that coffee prices are rising, and like you said, that Brazilian coffee prices and global coffee prices have been rising well before these tariffs were implemented or even announced. And now the potential effect of the tariffs will be kind of on top of what's already been going on with a very challenging year in the global coffee market, including in Brazil.
Could the U.S. coffee industry, Ricky, is there any way for them to replace Brazil? Can they look for alternative sources of supply?
There are certainly options. There are options for seeking to import more coffee from places like Vietnam, which has had its own severe weather problems, Indonesia, Ethiopia, perhaps some other countries in Latin America. It is still the case that most of the coffee import in the U.S. is from the countries throughout Latin America and down to Brazil. But the problem with that, and it's related to really most food products, in fact, there are very few exceptions on this, the supply is inelastic. And that's just kind of a fancy way of saying that it's not as if there are stores of coffee sitting around in places like Vietnam or Indonesia or Ethiopia that the US can just purchase during a time of need. Most coffee in a given growing season is accounted for through, contracts and other arrangements. So the capacity for the US or really any country to pivot in the short term and shore up or augment supplies is pretty limited. And that's true for coffee, which is a high value product. Most of that stuff is already spoken for.
Can I ask you, Rick, I'm just curious, what is domestic production actually like?
Very small. The United States is technically a player, but between Hawaii, which is mostly the Kona region, the Big Island, and Puerto Rico, we're talking about best case scenario 3% of the coffee produced in the U.S. I'm sorry, consumed in the U.S. And it might even be smaller than that because there is a market of exporting coffee from places like Kona around the world. So honestly, it's probably closer to around 1% of the coffee that we drink as Americans is grown domestically. And there's, given land constraints in both those places, these are islands we're talking about, there's effectively no capacity to ramp that up and substitute what we've been importing.
So what do coffee roasters actually do here then, Ricky? How do you navigate this tariff? I mean, do you try and change the recipe? Do you eat it? Do you try to pass it along to Ricky and Josh? What levers can they pull?
In the short run, it's absolutely going to be a combination of eating it and passing these along. Probably the number one question that I've been receiving since these tariffs were first announced is, who's going to eat them? Who is going to feel them? There's a wealth of research on tariffs. And to be fair, these are mostly affecting row crops, the building blocks of the food supply chain. So corn, wheat, soybeans. But there's a lot of work that's been done on the first Trump administration on what were the impacts of those tariffs. And just like you just said, it's been shown that the brunt of these tariffs was borne by a combination of firms, typically manufacturers, retailers, and then mostly consumers. And the reason for that is simple. Most food companies operate on very thin margins. There was a narrative that became pervasive during COVID and the aftermath that a lot of companies were engaging in unfair pricing or price gouging. Of course, I'm open to the idea that there have been some bad actors, but in general, it's pretty easy to look at the CPI and PPI data from BLS, the numbers that you guys cited to kick this segment off, and see that margins are not only thin, but they've been shrinking during this inflationary period of the last 3, 4 years. So the capacity for importers and roasters, and then especially retailers, to eat this and see their margins shrink even more, very, very limited. So we can expect to see coffee price inflation, which is already one of the fastest moving categories in terms of the CPI, food prices that we look at. It's one of the few categories that's really been experiencing sustained inflation throughout 2025. Almost likely we haven't seen the peak yet. That's going to continue to climb in the next, my best guess is 3 to 5 months.
You're going where I wanted to lead you there, Ricky, because I was going to ask you, coffee futures, you're at your highest level in 2 months. They're having their best month since January. And I was going to ask you where you expect to see prices in the months ahead. Can we, what levels would you be looking for?
It is very hard to imagine a scenario where retail coffee price inflation cools off in the next couple of months. So yeah, I'm going to stick with that. We can expect to see those prices continue to increase substantially for my best guess is the next 3 to 5 months. And the advice that I would offer to you and your listeners is if you want to get a feel for where coffee prices or really any retail prices are going, look at the corresponding producer price index. When you hear about food price inflation, usually folks are talking about the CPI, the consumer price index. And that makes sense because that's calculated based on the retail prices that, the Rickies of the world pay when we go to the supermarket. But the PPI, those are business to business prices and they're much forward looking. And the trajectory of increase for those prices for farm and wholesale prices for coffee beans has been even more dramatic than the retail prices, which means we still haven't seen the biggest gains. There's more to come. And we haven't even been talking about the tariffs on steel and aluminum. And, the coffee supply chain is one that would be hit particularly hard by that in terms of the packaging and the sort of capital inputs that are required to grind coffee and store it and keep it fresh and temperature control and all of that. So once those steel and aluminum tariffs on places like China start to filter in the food supply chain, it's only going to stack on top of these commodity price impacts that we're already seeing.
Ricky, great to have you on the show today. Thanks for walking us through that. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.